morning once again. Blessing of the Lord be upon you.
We bless you in the name of the Lord.
Take a look at the lesson entitled The Compassionate Christ. We'll start off with 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. And from the King James Version, I don't often quote from, read from, have sermons from the King James Version, but this one kind of hits what I really want to talk about this morning. Peter writes, "Finally, be ye all of one mind, having compassion one of another, love as brethren, be pitiful, be courteous, not rendering evil for evil, or railing for railing, but contrariwise blessing, knowing that ye are thereunto called, that ye should inherit a blessing." That ye should inherit a blessing. And we're talking, Danny's leading our class on Wednesday nights in the book of Galatians, and a lot of that, talking about in that third chapter that's coming up, is about inheriting a blessing, whether it's by the law or by the promise that the Lord had made to Abraham. So we want to inherit a blessing. If we want to inherit a blessing, there's something that we need to do. Now, to truly know Jesus, we have to have a clear view of his character. What was he really like? What type of a person was he? How did he go about life? And like all persons, Jesus is a composite of all the character traits, all of his characteristics. Therefore, we have to look at those individual traits to really get a picture of the total person. You know, some people, I don't know whether it's a gift that they have, they say that they can look at a person and they can just judge right off what type of a person they are, just like first sight. You know, I don't know. Some people, they judge people by how they speak, the words that they use. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's not. Yeah, I'm the type of person that I'd like to look at a person over a period of time and look at how they act. You know, how do they go about things in different situations to really understand the person. And I think that's truly what the Bible gives us, especially in those four gospel accounts. You get to know Jesus in just about every type of situation a human being could go through. Then you add to that the pre-incarnate Word going clear back to the beginning of time, and you can put together a really composite picture of Jesus and the person that he is. So as we glimpse at the heart of the Savior, we'll gain an overall view of the image of Christ that we are supposed to bear. We are supposed to be, or we are created in the image of our God. The Lord God created us. We were created in his image. We need to understand that composite nature and try to put forth those traits in our lives. And we can't read the New Testament, can't read about the life of Jesus without understanding that he was a very compassionate person. Yes, he had rules for his disciples to follow. He had guidelines. There were some things he would not permit, some things that he cherished, he valued very highly, and he let people know that. But he was compassionate in all things. So a few events in his ministry will help to make that point, that Jesus was a compassionate person. And we've got a lot of readings this morning. We'll gloss some of them. But understanding that Jesus was a compassionate person, Jesus was compassionate from a physical viewpoint. In Mark chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, just briefly in this. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. Anything they brought with them, could carry with them pretty much, it's got to be gone. So I have compassion on them. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away. Well, what happens? Well, 7 loaves and a few small fish were found among the people there. And that was used to feed 4,000 people. But understand the foundation of it. Jesus looked at them. You know, why didn't he send them away after the first day? Why didn't he send them away after the second day? But here it is on the third day. The food is gone. And the amazing thing, the people are still there. 4,000 people are still there. And Jesus takes that opportunity, because he has compassion on them, to make 7 loaves and a few small fish go about to feed 4,000 people. But it was based on his compassion for the people. In Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 16, again, we have a similar account. Let's drop down to verse 14. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. Again, the basis was there were people who had traveled alongside the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and he's traveling across in a boat. He gets to the other shore, and there they are. They've run to get to where he is going to be. And there are sick people. There are people there that probably had a hard time traveling that far. But notice, he had compassion on them. And when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place, and the day is now over, and the crowds, send the crowds away to go to the villages and buy food for themselves. But Jesus said, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. This occurred after the feeding of the 4,000, and they're saying, hey, just send them away. And Jesus says, you give them something to eat. You're my disciples. You take care of the problem. They want to stay here and listen. They want to stay here and learn. There might be some more that need some healing or whatever. Feeding of the 5,000. What a miracle that was. Pity concedes a need. And the disciples had pity. Notice that. The disciples come to him. Hey, they're going to be hungry. They have a little bit of compassion there. But compassion works to resolve the pain. We can recognize people who are hurting, and we can say, I feel sorry for them. But what compassion do we have to try to help alleviate the pain or resolve the pain? And that's the concept that I think Jesus was showing us when he talks about, or where the Bible talks about, compassion. Another instance, Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 15, Jesus enters the town by the name of Nain, and as he's going through the crowd, he comes to the gate, and there's a man who's died. He's been carried out. He's the only son of his mother, and she's a widow. Now, understand social implications of that. She's got no one to protect her now. She's got no one that can go to the law court now. She's got no one to work for her. She's got very few options in life. If she doesn't have some money saved up at home, she doesn't have some property to sell, then even if she has property to sell, there might be some relative who will take it. She doesn't have very many options going on. Look at verse 13. And when the Lord saw her, not the dead man, but when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. And he came up and touched the bier, and the bear stood still. And he said, young man, I say to you, arise. And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. You know, this widow didn't ask for anything, did she? But out of compassion, Jesus, knowing what the life of this woman would be, having lost her only son, he, out of compassion, restored the son to her. Oh yeah, there are further implications on it. He wanted to show that he could raise someone from the dead. He wanted people to believe that he was the Son of God. But again, he acted out of compassion, and he moved to do something about the situation that this woman was in and to relieve the problem. Did he raise every widow's son in all of Israel? Well, no. But that doesn't mean he didn't have some sort of pity or compassion for every person who lost someone. And someday there will be a resurrection, something for us to look forward to. The compassion shown by Jesus in the physical arena pales in comparison to the compassion he demonstrated in the spiritual affairs of human beings. The spiritual affairs. Mark 6:31 through 34. And he said to them, that was his disciples, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now when many saw them going and recognized them, they ran there on foot from all the towns and got ahead of them. Right? This is prelude to a previous story. Then when they went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were, what? Like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. First of all, you look at that, and he's got his apostles, his disciples that are there, the ones that were with him, and they've been so crowded by people. You know, we kind of think of it in terms of, oh, there might be 10 or 12 or 15 people, you know, with Jesus. No, look at those accounts we looked at earlier. Sometimes there are 5,000 people with Jesus. Sometimes there are 4,000 people with Jesus surrounding him. Why do you think the Pharisees and the scribes and some of the priests and the rulers of the synagogues were so jealous of Jesus? The crowds followed him. He'd have to take off and try to get his apostles away from them so they could just have time to relax for a little bit. You know, we all need a little bit of time to relax every now and then, don't we? Yes. But even with that, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Yes, all those scribes, all those Pharisees, all those rulers of the synagogue, all those priests who were teachers, all of them, the rulers, the kings, and they were still like sheep without a shepherd. And they yearned for what Jesus was teaching them. They yearned for what he was saying. And yes, for a little healing, yes, but he didn't heal all of them. He healed a lot of them. He didn't do miracles for all of them, but a lot of them. But they wanted to hear that message from God. And that's why they would go out. So many of them at one time just to hear him. So he put aside his own need for rest, his own need maybe for a meal, and tended to their spiritual needs. I think that's what he was really wanting in the first place, wasn't it? To tend to those spiritual needs, to what? For the lost sheep of the house of Israel, to bring them back. In Matthew 23:37 through 39, as Jesus was overlooking the city of Jerusalem, weeping, he said, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. how often I would have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is he who comes in the name of Jesus Christ. Their spirituality was bankrupt. Their spiritually bankrupt condition left them ripe for destruction, and AD 70 was coming very quickly for them. And he saw that, and he wept for them, and he had enough compassion on them. You know what happens right after that? That's right next to what's called his Passion Week, when he goes to the cross, suffers and dies in that last vain attempt to get them to turn to God. In John chapter 11, verse 38 through 42, then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. Listen to this. But I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. Jesus was probably grieved at Martha and Mary, because some of the things that they said like, Lord, if you'd have been here, my brother would not have died. Lord, it's your fault. But it wasn't even for Martha and Mary that he brought Lazarus back from the dead. Look at that. On account of the people standing around, that they might believe that you sent me. He was grieved more at the lack of faith that Martha and Mary had shown, and that of the Jews, the lack of the faith of the Jews. They should have believed that he was the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, the church of the New Testament exhibited the compassion of Christ. The Christians of the first century met the physical needs of others. Acts chapter 2, verse 42 through 47. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers. And all who believed, going down to verse 44, were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. Well, why would they do that? Because they listened to what Jesus had said and what the apostles were saying, that within a generation, Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. They wouldn't have anything. They may as well give some away and share it with others. And you know what? They also were thinking that Jesus would come back really soon. Verse 47. Praising God and having favor with all the people, and the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. So the church grew as it practiced Christ-like compassionate benevolence. Benevolence. The poor. The ones who had come to Jerusalem for Passover, and they crucified Jesus later at Pentecost. The doors of the kingdom were opened. And you know what happened? A lot of those people who came for Passover and were converted didn't leave. They didn't go home. They stayed in Jerusalem. They stayed in Jerusalem as members of the church. A lot of them who were from Jerusalem. They fed them. They housed them. They clothed them. They were all with one accord, practicing that Christ-like compassion for others. In Acts chapter 11, verses 27 through 30, now in these days, prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them named Agabus stood up, foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world. This took place in the days of Claudius Caesar. So the disciples determined, every one according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. And they did so, sending it to the elders, by the hand of Barnabas and Saul. The ethnic Gentile disciples learned to be compassionately benevolent, just like the church in Jerusalem. Why? Because just like the church in Jerusalem, they wanted to be Christ-like in their compassion. The first century church was compassionate to men's spiritual needs also, not just the physical, but the spiritual. Acts chapter 8 and verse 4. Now those who were scattered, and that was because of the persecution that was brought on to the disciples, they went everywhere preaching the word. That was the main purpose of the church, was preaching and teaching the word, preaching and teaching the gospel. The early church was compassionate for lost people. They even went to the Samaritans, didn't they? We find Philip going up to Samaria. The early church was compassionate for the lost Gentiles. Hey, that's where Peter went. He converted Cornelius. That's in Acts chapter 10. He was the first one to do that. But even after that, you have Paul and Barnabas, missionary journey. Paul and Silas, missionary journeys throughout the known world. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 19 through 22. Paul writes, so then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. Verse 22, in him you also are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. That's because of that compassion. The compassion that the early church had for souls. Even the souls of Samaritans who the Jews hated. And Gentiles that the Jews wanted nothing to do with. But the church, because they developed that compassion, that Christ-like compassion, went to all the world preaching the gospel of Jesus. Another compassion shown by the early church was an adherence to the truth. In 1 John chapter 5, verse 2 through 4, John writes, by this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and obey his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. For everyone who has been born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. You notice how that love and truth and obey and faith are all put in that paragraph together? And it talks about our compassion, doesn't it? The compassion that we need to have. Our compassion toward each child of God, but also the lost. The church was and is diametrically opposed to every form of false doctrine. We need to be. No one is going to be saved by a lie. It's only the truth that will save. So as Christians, we must be compassionate just as Christ was compassionate. That means we will demonstrate compassion in both the physical and spiritual areas. And emotional. Let's just drop back, and I probably should have included that. The reason Jesus had compassion on that widow who lost her only son, there was some emotional compassion there. Her emotional state. Well, we cannot miraculously feed multitudes, but we can help to feed the hungry. And I'm glad that we do that. We go over and beyond in helping in that way. We cannot raise the dead, but we can be like a son or a daughter, mother or father to someone in need. James 1:27. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit to visit the orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Yeah. To help. But that stems from compassion. The compassion that we would have on others. We must have compassion, or not just pity, but compassion for those in need and for the lost. We must demonstrate compassion for the truth by opposing every false doctrine. To be a Christian is to be Christ-like. If we are not Christ-like, you know what? Then we're not Christian. That should make sense. So Paul challenges us, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 1, imitate me even as I also imitate Christ. Boy, now there's a challenge. Imitate Paul as Paul imitates Christ. But see, Paul could say that to the Corinthians, right? Because he was the one who established the church in Corinth. He's the one that wrote 2 letters to them. And boy, a couple times in those letters, he was pretty rough with them, wasn't he? Telling them how wrong they were, challenging them about the truth, challenging them also to be, what? Compassionate one to another. But Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 and 9, again, finally, be ye all of one mind, having compassion one of another, love as brethren, be pitiful, be courteous, not rendering evil for evil, or railing for railing, but contrariwise, blessing, knowing that ye are thereunto called, that ye should inherit a blessing. Knowing that ye are thereunto called. See, that's a challenge for us, isn't it? Knowing that we have been called. We've been called out of the world, but we've also been called into something. We've been called into Christ. What was that song? Into the heart of Jesus, deeper and deeper I go. Well, how deep do we have to go? How deep should we go? We got to go at least to find that compassionate side of Jesus. And in finding that compassionate side of Jesus, we begin to develop that character of Jesus that makes us so much like him. To be called to follow Christ was and is to develop within us individually and collectively the character of Jesus Christ. And again, one of those first traits that we must put on is that deep and abiding compassion for others. How could the body not be compassionate when the head, it's a capital H, the head of the body was filled with and moved by such wonderful compassion? Well, that's all I've got. You know what? I think that's enough for today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. If you have a need, please let your request be made known as we stand and sing the invitation song.